Hello, YouTube, and welcome back to the Japan Politics Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Whitaker, and this is the place where we discuss all things relating to Japanese politics in English. And this week, I want to talk about a crisis that's affecting Japan at the moment and has been for, I believe, a few weeks or so now. And that's that there's a rice crisis as the price of rice is increasing and making it increasingly more expensive, harder for people to get hold of rice. And why has this happened? Well, essentially, it's because in the previous year, there was a increase in the weather that made the conditions for growing rice harder, and that's now affecting the supply coming into this year and making it more scarce, more expensive in the shops, and creating this issue. Now, obviously, rice is very important with Japan. It's very associated with the Japanese diet, and there's many famous recipes and dishes associated with rice. And many of Japan's best known dishes. So it's also, you could imagine it creating an impact on the restaurant industry, prices there, the availability to create every dish, and then effectively also having a knock-on impact into tourism, as a record number of people are going into Japan and wanting to try the Japanese diet and all these famous dishes. You can imagine it also impacting on that as well in the economy. As well as obviously having an impact for citizens and creating a cost of living crisis and making it an increased scarcity and cost associated with getting rice into your diet. Now, this has led to, I believe, in the previous 5 months, the price of rice has hit record highs, and it's so 5 consecutive months of this problem. And also the price for wholesalers is up by 69%, and that's before obviously it even gets to the shops and then gets marked up to reflect that in order to make a profit. So 69% wholesale price, and I believe that's the highest rise that Japan has seen since records began in 2006, as monitored by the government there. So it's quite a sharp increase and unprecedented, really, in recent years. So what's the government response to this crisis been? Well, they've released now 200,000 tons of rice from the government's national reserve out to try and increase the supply, lower the price, and make it more available. So we'll have to see how that goes. This is unusual because you typically see this reserve used as there was maybe a natural disaster like an earthquake or a blight or something. It's not typically used just because there's a high price or a general scarcity caused by weather conditions. But I suppose you could argue that this was due to unusual weather the previous year, and that's creating this high price rise. So you could maybe say it's a natural event, it's just delayed, and only now are you seeing it affect generally the whole of Japan. And so it's maybe just, you could perhaps see it as a crisis that's just been delayed in time, as opposed to immediately following like a natural disaster and then having to release this supply to respond to that immediately. You could also compare that, very interestingly, to, I believe, the US government has a national oil reserve, and which they released to respond to crises. And I remember President Biden released the oil reserve in response to the record high gas prices during his presidency, which I think was critiqued by some who disagreed with him, effectively blaming him for, because many conservative critics blamed him for creating the high gas prices, and then they said he was using something again that was used to respond to like a national emergency, but using it for just to lower prices. In his case, he released it to try and lower the gas prices, and you could say the same thing's happening in Japan. They're releasing this emergency stockpile of rice to just try and get the market under control and lower the price. And also, I've seen circulating on Twitter a number of anecdotal, unverified, as far as I'm aware, unverified accounts of people saying that they've seen people reselling or buying up the limited amount of rice and then reselling it for high prices or stockpiling it to sort of price gouge in response to this crisis. Now, whenever there's a situation like this where there's a very scarce resource, you hear these sort of stories that's happened historically over time. It might not be the case, but then also this has happened you can think of examples like, for example, COVID, where people were caught hoarding PPE and soap. And I remember for a while, toilet paper, that was a very scarce resource. and some people made incredible profits by reselling PPE. Some people got raided and got caught and had the PPE taken off them, but some were able to price gouge and make it quite a bit of money in response to the sudden scarcity created by COVID. So it could be that simply these are rumours made up, but you can imagine that there is money to be made. But as I say, that's purely something anecdotal I've read, that there's potential people taking advantage by price gouging created by this crisis. There's a number of interesting things you consider. I've read some speculation that possibly foreign rice is something that could be imported, like cheaper foreign rice, to sort of bring that into the supply chain rather than relying so much on Japanese-produced rice. And so it'd be interesting to see if that happens. Obviously, that's difficult to arrange in the short term. So it'd be interesting if, as a result of this crisis, that was something that was brought more into the supply chain, and if that would have any sort of impact on domestic farmers' domestic supply in the long term, and then on the Japanese supply chain and the economy. But that's pure speculation. I'm unaware if that's something that might happen. But I've just read speculation about that online, and it's also. It will be interesting to see how effective this government measure is, because I believe it will be some time now that the government's decided to release these 200,000 tonnes of rice for then to make its way through the supply chain and then finally get to the end user. So we'll have to see how effective that is in the end and how long it takes to sort of dissipate the crisis and what impact it has on to sort of soften the prices, get rice back in the supermarkets, get people back into a position where they can buy rice a little bit more affordably, and how long it takes to dissipate and respond for this thing. This situation. Now, obviously, this is very bad for Ishiba at the moment. If this measure is effective, that might possibly play in his favour or at least dissipate the crisis. But it just seemed like things were beginning to go well for him. And this is the sort of thing that can undermine trust and create issues for a government if something like very basic like the cost of food can spiral into a bit of a crisis. So it will be interesting to see how this situation develops and what happens from there and how effective the government response is. The next story I'd like to talk about is relating to Japan's relation with Taiwan and also China. Basically, starting in May, the Ministry of Justice is going to allow people who are from the island of Taiwan, who have that as their nationality, are going to be allowed to register Taiwan as their country of origin, their nationality, on like a family register. And I believe this happens when someone from Taiwan, if they were to get married in Japan, then the marriage would be recorded and you'd ask the parties what their nationality is, where they're from. I believe previously the status quo was that if you're from Taiwan, by default you had to put your nationality down as China on the family register, and that would be registered as your nationality. But that's now, they're intending to change that so that you can now list Taiwan. Now, obviously this has given this two China question, the one China status, throughout the diplomatic world, and sort of the sensitivity of whether you acknowledge Taiwan as a sovereign independent country. This is a very hot button, and it's also very interesting timing given we just talked about the other week of the Chinese were removed a buoy from Japanese claimed islands, and that was seen as potentially an easing of tension or a potential overture towards Japan from China ahead of them having a summit, a meeting between the leaders, between Ishiba and Xi Jinping. So it seemed like perhaps that was an indication that relations might get warmer. But it would appear Japan's gone the other way, and they're now taken this decision that's upset China a bit, and China have registered a protest and said, this is really infringing on our politics. You shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be playing politics with Taiwan and inserting yourself into this. But the Japanese minister, the Ministry of Justice, has dismissed this and said, no, this is purely a domestic issue, and we have every right to determine what goes down effectively on our family registered and how we register marriages. So interesting to see what comes from that, if this is just a one-off of them rectifying this. But as I say, on the back of the meeting with Trump and then the future meeting with the Chinese leader, it's very curious timing that they'd suddenly change a status quo that I believe has been going on with how you register marriages in Japan for quite some time. It's also interesting because the Shinzo Abe's widow has also met with the new leader of Taiwan. They've had a meeting, and This is seen as maybe a little bit provocative. Obviously, Abe's widow's a private citizen, just as when she met Trump, before Ishiba met Trump, she can very legitimately say, I'm a private citizen, I'm entirely free to meet with who I like. But it's interesting timing that it's happened just on the back of this announcement. And like I say, just ahead of this China meeting, perhaps this is leverage or it's purely coincidental, and Abe's widow wanted to meet with the Taiwan leader anyway. But the Taiwan government has welcomed the meeting and welcomed the news and said that's very positive, and they're glad to see relations with Japan moving in this direction, basically, to summarise it. So very interesting what's happened there, and I look forward to seeing what happens with these China meetings and if anything further comes of this. Back into the Japanese domestic politics realm. Obviously, as Ishiba is now leading a minority government, he's having to work more with different parties in order to get his budgets and his legislation through. Previously in the past, there's been some cooperation, obviously apart from with his junior coalition partner, Komeito. He's had to work with the DPFP in the past. There's been some overtures there. But now, as he's looking forward to his fiscal budget for 2025, it looks like he may be drifting more towards working with Ishin rather than the DPFP. And so currently they're working on a document that's drafted but not agreed. And I believe there's been, as well as this being a sort of a general fiscal bill for 2025, I believe there's been some concessions. I think he was looking there was efforts at first to work with the DPFP, but I think in the end, for whatever reason, they've now found it a little bit easier to work with Ishin to get their votes over the line. And of course, if Ishin were to lend their votes to Komeito and the LDP, that it's only just a minority government. That would very comfortably give them the amount of votes they need to get the legislation through if everyone votes on party lines. So it's a perfectly plausible way for them to get budgets through, to just say, oh, we'll try and work with Ishin this time. That's perfectly that's a perfectly safe way of passing legislation if you can rely on them. So it would appear they're going to give Ishin some of the policies they wanted in order to get their support on this bill. And as I say, this has been drafted. It's not. I think the Ishin sort of have drafted a potential agreement on what the legislation will be, and they're sort of going away to consider it over the next few days. But tentatively, I think they're probably going to get some policy concessions back. Probably what they will be looking to get, and what I've heard reported they might get. One of the things they would want would be to remove the income restriction, at which point you provide assistance to high school students. So effectively, you'll take away the amount of money, the barrier, or raise the barrier based on the amount of income their parents have, at which point you begin to give the family assistance based on the amount of children they have in high school to support them going through their education, that sort of thing. And it may be that if that's what Ishin wants, and I believe that's part of their policies platform, and that would be as I say, this cooperation rather than working with the DPFP will get them over the line. And so it's interesting that DPFP previously took this tack of not going into coalition but working with the LDP, and then perhaps they could maybe look to their electorate and say, obviously we're distinct from the LDP, but we've got these clear policy aims, and that potentially could improve their popularity by going to their base and say, look, we ran against the LDP on these policies, but by working with them, we'll be able to get them while we're still a distinct party. It could be that Ishin perhaps could also do that now and say, okay, we haven't just sat outside of government, we've, politicked, we've worked with the LDP, and now we've got this very clear concession, and they can, appeal to, obviously, the parents, who will now be receiving, if this goes through, their extra benefit, and they'll be able to say they got some of their manifesto through, some of their policies, even if they aren't in government. And it's also very interesting, this, because, as we discussed previously, the DPFP leader, he was involved in a bit of a scandal, and rather than getting rid of him, they said they were suspending him for 3 months. That suspension's currently in place, and I believe it's in March this year, which is around the time this fiscal budget is going to be going through, is when he's coming back. So I wonder if it's interesting to think, because previously DPFP were to some extent working with the LDP on issue-by-issue basis. They were willing to discuss it. It's interesting to speculate whether him being gone has had any sort of effect on this. It could be purely coincidental and the party are following the same line. It's just negotiations have been difficult, or it could come from either side of these. It could be Ishiba or the DPFP. But it's interesting to speculate that in the time he's now out and suspended, that the LDP are now finding it more fruitful to work potentially with Ishin to get legislation through. And it'd be interesting to see if that sort of situation changes when he returns, or if, as I say, it's just pure coincidence. But it's interesting to think about whether this could be like a personality thing, because he's now not in the building ostensibly running things. He's suspended, whether that's had an impact on this. But that could entirely not be the case. It's just interesting to think about. But in any case, it seems like a win for Ishin that they've now got themselves as the clear party who's working to get legislation through. And if they can get any sort of tangible legislation through to, like I say, bolster support and say, we've achieved this, even though we're not in government, we've got these concessions out of the LDP. So potentially quite a big win for them if they get that through. Another news story that's happened this week is a further update on the scandal involving Governor Saito, the governor once and now again of the Hyogo province, who was faced a vote of no confidence, forced out of office, but then after he was accused of bullying and abuse of power. But then he stood firm and said, no, this is a conspiracy to oust me. I've done nothing wrong. I'm standing and to running again. And he runs sort of a very sort of Trumpian campaign of using social media and sort of painting himself as sort of the champion of sort of the working people, and it was him against the elites, basically, was how he painted it, sort of how him and his campaign sort of painted the situation. That worked, and he got voted back in. Now there's been a further development in this, in that two Hyogo assembly members have resigned from the committee, and now he was forced to stand down because there was an investigation into these scandals he was accused of. He then ran for office and was re-elected, but that investigation into this potential scandal, it's still very much ongoing by the same body of assembly members that voted to oust him from his government, that forced that election. Although he's sort of defied them ousting him by running again and getting re-elected, they're still able to continue this committee and investigation into him. That's still ongoing, and two of the committee members have resigned. And the reason being is that it's come out that they have leaked info relating to the investigation to Tachibana, who was he's the anti-NHK party politician, and he ran sort of a on paper separate campaign, but it was really a support Saito campaign where he was sort of running on Saito's behalf and really going to stump for him. And he had a big impact on the election, with his clips on social media, and supporting Saito really helped his campaign. He was sort of a pivotal figure there. So these two assembly members released information to him, which he then used, I believe, in his campaign. So that's quite a breach of confidence of the committee hearings. And now, although they've resigned from this committee, it remains to be seen, I think, if anything will happen to them. It's quite a breach of confidence for them to take information from the committee. And I believe the status quo, roughly to summarise it, was that the committee felt, while an election's ongoing, that they shouldn't be releasing any information about the investigation while it hadn't reached its conclusion, and they didn't want to affect the election in that way. But I think one of the assembly members, it's been reported that he felt that this wasn't quite right and that you should give the voters the information, and they should be more informed when making the choice. So there are two crucial bits of information that were leaked, I believe, to Tachibana, which may have impacted the campaign. The first information I read that was provided was a document that accused an assembly member, and bear in mind, this is the assembly that voted in the end to expel Saito before he ran for re-election. It accuses one assembly member, and it's just and as far as I'm aware, it's an accusation of being the mastermind behind activities to oust the governor. So obviously, you couldn't see if that was released to people that would impact their opinion. It's not necessarily proven, of course. And then another is an audio recording from within the committee. The audio recordings happened while they were questioning a witness, and then they were discussing essentially information relating to one of the witnesses. But I believe this information may not have been authenticated. And then basically the committee then said that it might not be appropriate to discuss this, and then effectively tried to halt that line of questioning and said it might not be appropriate to discuss this to take their point of view because it's not been authenticated. And that audio recording was then released, and then that allowed them to say, you see, they're trying to shut down the truth coming out. That, that's one way you could spin it, or that sort of thing. And so the reason the Assembly member presented for releasing these 2 bits of info were that he felt the public had a right to know, and you should be aware of the proceedings going on before they had to make their vote on the fate of Saito. I'm not saying that wasn't his motive. I don't know at all why in the end he chose to release it. But it does appear that this information being released did have an impact on the election and likely aided Saito and aided Tachibana. So, as I say, this investigation is now ongoing, and we've got a little bit more information as to how Tachibana was able to run this campaign and how Saito was able to succeed. So it's interesting to see what in the end the investigation will come out with and what the end result will be. As I say, this is still ongoing, and I believe we're expecting, I think in March this year, to find out the outcome of the committee. But it's yet another blow and more controversy added onto this situation, this to have come out now, and it really it seems to be ongoing. There's sort of scandal and complication with this story as things go on. So it'd be interesting to see in the end what the end result is, what the conclusions are made, and what happens to Governor Saito going forward. But yeah, yet another development in this case. And speaking of Governor Saito, it appears there's a potential case of not exactly the same situation, of course, but you could maybe make a comparison to it occurring again in politics within Japan. And the situation is that a mayor in Kishiwada, Osaka, has been forced to resign. There's been a unanimous vote by the assembly members to make him stand down, which is also, it was assembly members that made Saito step down, then voting. Same situation here, he's been forced to step down following a scandal, and now it looks like he could be considering running again. Which is precisely what Saito did. Obviously, the cases aren't the same. The circumstances are different. But it's been said that the mayor of Kishiwada is considering running again in the runoff election that's been caused by his own resignation on the back of a scandal. And so, not to say that one follows the other, that the cases are precisely the same. But you could see it as another instance of a politician being forced to resign in a scandal, and he, instead of, as you would expect to happen maybe in Western politics, them having to take that and it being untenable to run again, it would now appear that he's considering running in the runoff election caused by his own scandal and his own vacancy. And where in the instance of Saito, he was in the end successful, it appears that that's maybe more of a tenable thing to do in Japan when you're ousted by scandal to run again. But it's interesting that it's happened again following the Saito case. And in any other news, I'd like to talk about a story that maybe doesn't sound that serious on the surface, but is actually is kind of, yeah, it's not a pleasant story, which is that someone's thrown snowballs directly in the face of staff at a Sapporo snow festival. And at first you might think, oh, well, that's sort of what you'd expect at a snow festival, a playful snowball fight. But when you read into it, it's really not that pleasant. Essentially, it was a streamer, and this is maybe following sort of the tension that follows over touristification in Japan, which is the result of the low price of the yen and the interest in visiting Japan, which has caused a lot of visitors to Japan in the last couple of years. Record levels of visitors has been seen in the country, and that's maybe led to struggling to deal with the numbers, and in cases a little bit of tension. And there's also incidents in particular like the Johnny Somali incident, but in this case the streamer filmed himself throwing snowballs, and I believe it was in a sort of near a rest area within the snow festival. So it's a place it's not like an outdoor area where you'd maybe expect some people to be getting into playing around with snowballs, building snowmen, maybe even having a snowball fight. It was within like a rest area, and they threw it directly into the face of a staff member, which obviously, if done hard enough, could cause damage, and it's not nice to get a snowball right in the face. And as a result of this, I believe initially we're obviously upset at this, and then that security were involved, but there was no follow-up legal action taken. But I believe since there's been a criminal complaint filed against the streamer, and essentially there's been a bit of an upset. I believe there's been a petition filed against this incident happening, and obviously you shouldn't, when you're just doing your job, be expecting to be attacked. So on the face of it, you hear snowball at a snow festival, and you think, oh, it's not that serious. But in this case, it does sound a little bit unpleasant, and that the person who received it didn't really do anything, didn't encourage it anyway, and shouldn't, when you're just going about your job, expect to get that right in the face and to potentially risk injury. So it remains to be seen if anything will come of this, and if there'll be any action resulting from the criminal complaint. But it shows maybe a little bit of the tension that happens from tourist interactions, and maybe not being quite respectful enough of staff, and just doing things for attention on stream can maybe lead to these sort of unpleasant situations encountering. So it's unfortunate that's had to happen at a snow festival. It's just another interesting case of sort of the interactions that happen when you've had such an incredible amount of interest in visitors into Japan. And I believe the state of play with that is now that Hokkaido prefecture police are reviewing the criminal complaint, and they'll just decide how to go from there. But it's just another instance of things like people having to raise prices, restrict access to tourists, and sort of think about how you handle dealing with this increased number of tourists and things going forward. But that really rounds up the news. But yeah, thank you so much for listening, everyone. This has been the Japan Politics Podcast. I've been your host, Luke Whitaker. Sayonara, goodbye.